The drawing-room of Ashford House in Grosvenor Square held the peculiar silence of wealth, the sort that speaks more loudly than servants' footsteps ever could. Eleanor Fairborn stood near the window, her posture as unassuming as the dove-grey dress she had chosen with deliberate care that morning. The Dowager Duchess Rosalind Hartwell sat enthroned upon a settee of burgundy velvet, her lorgnette suspended from a silver chain, and her eyes, those terrible measuring eyes, fixed upon the young woman before her, with the precision of a botanist examining a specimen of uncertain classification. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. Outside, London's afternoon traffic moved in muffled rhythms along the square. Inside, only the faint crackle of the fireplace offered proof that time had not entirely stopped. "My dear Miss Fairborn," the Dowager began, her voice a study in controlled refinement, "I have received your reports on the Ashford Charitable Committee with considerable satisfaction. Your penmanship is exquisite. Your discretion is, I am told, beyond reproach." A pause. The lorgnette rose half an inch. "Yet I confess myself surprised, truly startlingly surprised, by the necessity of what I am about to ask of you." Eleanor's fingers, which had been resting upon her reticule, stilled. She had grown accustomed to the peculiar courtesies and conditional regard that shaped her world. A woman of her station inhabited a delicate equipoise between usefulness and invisibility. To be summoned to Ashford House, to be received alone in the Dowager's private drawing-room rather than the public morning chamber, was already an irregularity that had set her nerves awake. "Your Grace," Eleanor replied, her voice kept low and measured, "I am honoured by your confidence. Pray command me however I may serve." The Dowager set down her cup with a deliberate clink. "I require," she said, and here her tone took on the quality of a pronouncement issued from a judge's bench, "that you present yourself to society, to the ton, as the chosen bride of my son, the Duke of Ashford, for a duration of, shall we say, 8 weeks. The words fell like stones into still water. Eleanor's eyes lifted. Her hands gripped the edges of her reticule, and she could feel the small pulse that lived in the delicate bone of her inner wrist beginning to throb against the inside of her glove. "Your Grace," she began, but her breath had become shallow. I do not comprehend. I have no acquaintance with His Grace beyond the formal courtesies of committee business. To claim an understanding between us that does not— It is not a claim, Miss Fairborn. It is a performance." The Dowager's interruption was neither unkind nor cruel. It was absolute. "The ton traffics in appearance. We shall give them the appearance they have been demanding of my son for the past 18 months. Attentive glances, a presence at soirée, perhaps, at the right moment, a public declaration of esteem." A shaft of afternoon light crossed Eleanor's face. She looked suddenly very young, and also very still. "Your Grace, my reputation shall be protected by the name you appear to carry," the Dowager said. "Once this performance concludes, a modest marriage contract need not materialize. You shall return to your employment with references that will secure any respectable position you wish. You shall, in fact, be considerably elevated in the eyes of potential employers. A woman approved by the Duke of Ashford is a woman of unquestionable propriety." "And if I refuse?" The words escaped before Eleanor could weigh them. She lowered her gaze immediately, recognizing the impropriety of her directness. Yet something in her, some small, desperate corner where she still harbored the remnants of choice, had insisted upon the question. The Dowager set her lorgnette aside. "Then," she said quietly, "I shall have no choice but to inform the committee that my charitable work requires my attention elsewhere. Miss Fairborn would lose her post through no fault of her own, and London society would speculate as to why the Dowager had withdrawn her patronage. Within a fortnight, you would find yourself unemployable. The machinery of reputation operates swiftly when wound in reverse." Eleanor's hands, which had loosened slightly, tightened once more. It was not a threat, precisely. It was the simple, mathematical consequence of the society in which they both dwelt. The Dowager was not a cruel woman. She was a woman who understood the levers of her world and did not hesitate to use them. "I see, Your Grace," Eleanor said. "You see, or you accept." The Dowager's gaze was steady, almost curious. "I accept, Your Grace." The words seemed to echo in the drawing-room. Eleanor heard them as if another woman had spoken, some other woman who dwelt in a world where she said yes to commands that shattered the careful geometry of her survival. "Excellent." The Dowager rose with the grace born of decades of unquestioned authority. "My son has been informed of this arrangement. He is not, shall we say, enthusiastically disposed toward it, but he understands the necessity. The estate requires an appearance of stability. The inheritance politics demand that certain rumours be forestalled, and I, Miss Fairborn, will not countenance my son's solitude being weaponized against him any longer. She moved to the mantelpiece, where a portrait of a man in riding dress looked down with stern benevolence. The Duke will call upon you tomorrow at the residence of Mrs. Weatherby, where I believe you lodge. You shall go together to the gallery opening on Thursday. You shall appear at the Ashford ball on Saturday. You shall sit beside him at Lord Pemberton's dinner, and you shall smile, Miss Fairborn, as if you have been chosen for reasons that matter. Yes, Your Grace. There is, however, one matter of particular delicacy. The Dowager turned back, and her expression had shifted into something more complex, not quite maternal, yet not unfeeling. There is a register, the Ashford marriage register. It has for 7 generations recorded the name of the Duchess at the moment of her formal acceptance into the family. My son's page remains blank. If this performance is to have credibility, that page must be filled. Eleanor's throat had become very dry. A false entry, Your Grace. An entry that will be struck through after the agreed term, the Dowager said. But yes, your name must be written, to silence those who would whisper that the Duke was managed by circumstance rather than choice. The ink must precede the truth. And there in that phrase, the ink must precede the truth, Eleanor understood that she had crossed into a world where the boundary between performance and reality had been erased, or at least rendered so thin that one might step through it without notice. She inclined her head. I understand, Your Grace, she said. When shall the entry be made? Tomorrow, the Dowager replied. After the Duke's call. We shall do it quietly. Just the Dowager's hand, the register, and yourself. A small ceremony of the temporary becoming for a brief season the real. The next morning arrived with the quality of a held breath. Eleanor had scarcely slept, her mind circling through the peculiar mathematics of her new circumstance. 8 weeks of visible attachment to a man she had met only in the formal geography of drawing rooms. 8 weeks of being observed, documented, judged. 8 weeks of living a fiction that might, if society chose to believe it, become more dangerous than any truth. Mrs. Weatherby's drawing room in Belgrave Square was modest but respectable, the sort of place where a companion might be received without impropriety. The furniture was of good quality but worn. The wallpaper, though clean, spoke of several years' tenure. It was here at 3:30 that the Duke of Ashford presented himself. Eleanor rose as he entered. The sight of him struck her with an unexpected force, not because he was handsome, though he possessed the lean, composed features of his rank, but because she could see, in the arrangement of his shoulders and the careful steadiness of his gaze, the precise nature of his reluctance. He was a man being conducted through a duty, and he met her eyes with the polite distance one reserves for subordinates and strangers. Miss Fairborn, he said, and his voice held the modulation of perfect courtesy. I trust my mother has been altogether clear regarding the nature of our acquaintance. She has, Your Grace, Eleanor replied, and I have accepted the terms she outlined. Something flickered in his expression, not relief precisely, but perhaps resignation. He took the seat Mrs. Weatherby indicated, maintaining a distance that was scrupulously proper. I am not, the Duke began, and here his voice softened fractionally, naturally inclined toward deception. I shall make that plain. Yet my mother has explained, with considerable eloquence, why this performance serves both the estate and the household. I shall fulfill my portion of the arrangement. And I shall fulfill mine, Your Grace, Eleanor said. A silence fell between them, not uncomfortable, yet freighted with the weight of an unspoken covenant. He studied her with those grey-green eyes, and she found herself wondering what he saw, a woman of utility, a temporary solution to a problem of inheritance and reputation, or simply a young woman who had been cornered into compliance by the inexorable machinery of a society that offered women such limited choices. My mother intends that we shall be seen together at the gallery opening, the Duke said, returning to practical matters. You will need to present yourself as, shall we say, an acquaintance I have come to regard with particular favour. There will be speculation. The ton is skilled at detecting artifice, yet also remarkably capable of accepting it if presented with sufficient confidence. I understand, Your Grace. I do not know if you do, he said quietly, and something in the remark, some small acknowledgement of the peculiarity and difficulty of her position, caused her to look at him more fully. This manner of arrangement is not uncommon in our circles, but the parties to it are usually of more equal standing. You are placing yourself in a position of considerable vulnerability. Should the arrangement be discovered prematurely, should there be any whisper of impropriety, Your prospects would be damaged far beyond what my mother has suggested. Eleanor's composure wavered slightly. She touched the inside of her wrist, that small, hidden place where her pulse ran. I am aware of the consequences, Your Grace, she said. I have accepted them. He nodded slowly, as if recognizing in her response a kind of courage, or at least a kind of desperation, that mirrored his own. Then we shall begin tomorrow at the gallery, he said. My carriage will call for you at 2 o'clock. You will take my arm. We will stand before the paintings as if they are the reason for our proximity, rather than estate politics and inheritance necessity. When he rose to depart, something caused him to pause. His fingers, long, capable fingers bearing the weight of his signet ring, moved toward the brim of his hat, but not before she saw him press his thumb against the ring's edge, that small gesture of internal restraint that she would come to recognize as his habit. Miss Fairborn, he said, I would ask that you call me Alistair when we are alone. Your Grace is the language of performance. Alistair is the language of truth, at least in this small matter. Eleanor felt something shift within her, some small realignment of the careful distance she had maintained. And you must call me Eleanor, Your Grace, she replied, or rather Alistair. If we are to be believed as acquainted, then we must acquire the habit of true familiarity, even if only in private. He smiled then, and it was a genuine smile, not the practiced expression of a man accustomed to public ceremony, but something unguarded and almost boyish. Eleanor, he said, testing the name, it suits you better than Miss Fairborn ever could. The Ashford marriage register resided in the library at Ashford House, a room of solemn proportions, where the afternoon light fell through long windows in geometric patterns of gold and shadow. The register itself lay upon a mahogany lectern, its pages yellowed with age, the ink entries of generations of dukes, rendered in careful copperplate script. Eleanor stood before it with the Dowager Duchess on one side and Alistair on the other, though he had positioned himself near the window, as if the very act of witnessing the falsification of the record required that he maintain some physical distance from the deception. The Dowager held a pen. The ink was fresh, not the faded sepia of the historical entries, but a black that seemed to swallow light. She opened to the final page, where a single name was already written in the Duke's hand: Alistair Hartwell, Duke of Ashford, 8th of this name, Anno Domini, 1842. Beside it, the space where the Duchess's name should appear was blank, a void shaped like destiny. Miss Fairborn, the Dowager said, and her voice had taken on the quality of ritual. This register has been the honor roll of the Ashford lineage since 1687. To have one's name inscribed upon these pages is to have one's claim upon history acknowledged by something more permanent than memory. She dipped the pen. I write now, not as your mother-in-law, for you are not, but as the guardian of this house's record. I write because society requires proof, and because my son has chosen, through circumstance and through necessity, to present you as his bride. The pen touched paper. Eleanor Fairborn, the Dowager wrote, her hand steady and practiced. Accepted into the House of Ashford, Anno Domini 1851, 8 weeks from this date, for the purposes of protection and necessity. She added the date, and then, deliberately, drew a line through the entire entry, not erasing it, but marking it as provisional, temporary, a truth that carried the expiration of a promissory note. Eleanor watched her own name appear in the register, like a woman observing her own burial. The ink seemed impossibly black against the aged paper. She could see in those carefully formed letters the mechanism by which her invisibility had been transformed into a dangerous visibility. Alistair stepped forward. He took the pen from his mother and in the margin wrote beneath the crossed-through entry, as witnessed by Alistair J. Hartwell, Duke of Ashford, in acknowledgement of necessity and in honor of the courage this entails. The Dowager regarded this addition with something that might have been surprise, or might have been approval. I will not, she said, alter a word of it. She closed the register. Miss Fairborn, or rather Eleanor, for we are now in this room past the formalities, you are inscribed. Whether that inscription shall remain or shall be struck through in 8 weeks' time depends upon circumstances beyond my control. But for now, for this season, you are the Duchess of Ashford in all things but name, and in name as well, inscribed in ink that will outlast us all. Eleanor felt a tremor move through her. From the place where her heart beat to the extremities of her fingers, she had crossed a threshold she had not fully understood until this moment. The pretense was no longer a matter of graceful deceptions in drawing rooms. It was now a matter of record. She was written into history, even if only in invisible ink beneath a line of negation. Alistair touched her arm, a gesture so brief it might have been imagined, and in that moment she understood that he too recognized the magnitude of what his mother had demanded of them both. "We begin the performance in earnest," he said quietly. "Tomorrow at the gallery. And perhaps, Eleanor, we shall discover whether 8 weeks is sufficient time for fiction to become something approaching the truth." The gallery of Messrs. Ashton and Clegg stood upon a corner of Bond Street, its windows displaying the solemn geometry of old masters, rendered in gilt frames. It was a Wednesday afternoon, precisely the moment when society's more respectable members conducted their cultural observations, when the light slanted through the skylights at an angle that rendered both paintings and observers in equal flattery. Eleanor descended from the Duke's carriage with a sensation not dissimilar to stepping onto a theatrical stage. She had dressed with deliberate care, a dress of muted sage silk, with collar and cuffs of the finest Brussels lace, and gloves that had been pressed until they bore the geometry of absolute propriety. Yet beneath the precision of her toilette, her heart moved with irregular rhythm. Alistair offered his arm with the same formal courtesy he might have extended to any acquaintance. Yet his eyes, when they met hers for the briefest moment, carried something she could not quite name, perhaps acknowledgement of the artifice they were about to enact, or perhaps apology for the burden of it. Inside the gallery, the afternoon light fell upon canvases of Renaissance devotion and Baroque excess. The space held perhaps 24 visitors, scattered in small clusters of murmured appreciation. And then, as they crossed the threshold, Eleanor felt the shift, the subtle, imperceptible reorganization of attention that occurred whenever anyone of the Duke's rank entered a public space. Heads turned, conversations suspended themselves at their midpoint, the way a held breath suspends the moment between heartbeats. Eyes assessed and catalogued. The machinery of social observation, which operated constantly in London's drawing rooms, now focused itself upon them with concentrated intensity. "The Rembrandt," Alistair said, his voice pitched at that volume which is audible to one's companion, and inadvertently to those standing near, "is considered the finest work in the collection. Shall we view it?" They moved deeper into the gallery, and Eleanor became acutely aware of the geometry of their bodies, his arm steady beneath her gloved hand, the proximity that was proper and yet, in the context of their arrangement, seemed weighted with dangerous intimacy. She smoothed the edge of her reticule, a small gesture of internal alignment, as they approached the Rembrandt. It depicted a biblical scene, a woman kneeling in posture of absolute supplication before a figure of authority. There was something in the composition that struck Eleanor as uncomfortably resonant with her own circumstance, the rendering of vulnerability before power, the question of whether such submission might contain within it some form of dignity or merely its appearance. "It is remarkable," she said, forcing her voice to steadiness, "how the artist renders the woman's face. There is no shame in it, despite the posture of submission, only resignation, perhaps, or acceptance of circumstance beyond her control." Beside her, Alistair had gone very still. "You perceive," he said slowly, "what most observers miss. The majority see only the gesture of servitude. You have discerned that servitude itself may contain a form of integrity if the one who submits does so with full knowledge of what she surrenders." Their eyes met, and in that moment, the gallery and its other occupants seemed to recede into irrelevance. There was only the painting and the two of them, and the recognition that passed between them, unspoken, dangerous, and absolutely mutual. "Your Grace," Eleanor said, and the formality of the address seemed suddenly like a protection, a wall she could erect between the performance and the truth that threatened to bleed through it. "Shall we view the Turner landscape? I believe it is displayed in the Eastern Room." They moved on, and behind them, Eleanor could feel the whispers beginning, the soft cascade of speculation that would by evening have been transmitted to every drawing-room in Mayfair. The Duke of Ashford, it would be said, had been observed in intimate conversation with a young woman of modest bearing. The particularity of their attention to one another had not gone unmarked. Was there, the ton would wonder, substance beneath the appearance? In the Eastern Room, where the Turner paintings rendered storm and tranquility in strokes of particular genius, Alistair paused before a seascape. For a moment he stood in silence, his thumb working the edge of his signet ring with that familiar gesture of restraint. "I received a letter this morning," he said, so quietly that she had to lean slightly nearer to hear him, "from my solicitor. My cousin Crowhurst has begun to circulate rumors regarding the stability of the estate. He claims that without a clear indication of my intentions regarding marriage, the inheritance, is vulnerable to legal challenge. He is in essence manufacturing urgency to justify his own influence. Eleanor turned to face him, her expression a careful study in concerned attention for the benefit of any observers. What manner of challenge could he bring to bear, Your Grace? The law is rarely clear when money is involved, Alistair replied. If he can construct a narrative of mismanagement or instability, he can appeal to the Crown for guardianship of certain properties. It is a slow mechanism, but it is effective. My mother understood this when she devised her arrangement with you. She was not, I think, entirely motivated by sentiment. No, Eleanor agreed. I suspected as much. He turned to look at her fully then, and his expression contained something that resembled gratitude, or perhaps simply the relief of having his mother's machinations acknowledged without the pretense of affection or redemptive purpose. You are very practical, Eleanor, he said. I find that I had expected someone less willing to perceive the mechanisms by which she moves us. I have lived on the margins of society long enough to understand how it operates, Your Grace. The machinery of social control is visible only to those upon whom it presses. Behind them, a footfall on the gallery floor. Alistair extended his arm more firmly through hers, and they continued their promenade, presenting to the world the image of a couple engaged in genuine companionship, an image that, with each passing moment, seemed to Eleanor to contain more truth and less performance than either of them might have anticipated. The gallery opening took place on Thursday evening, an event designed to combine cultural significance with social theatre. The space had been transformed by the addition of flowers, hothouse roses in urns of Chinese porcelain, and the careful repositioning of paintings to create vistas that led the eye from one masterwork to another with the precision of architectural design. The Dowager Duchess was already present when Alistair and Eleanor arrived, standing before a grouping of Dutch landscapes with the air of someone conferring legitimacy upon them through the sheer force of her attention. She wore black silk with touches of silver, and her expression when she observed their entrance contained an approval that was almost imperceptible but nonetheless absolute. Miss Fairborn, she said, extending her hand with a gesture that transformed greeting into performance, how delightful to see you have accepted my son's invitation to view the collection. Your taste in dress is, as always, impeccable. The compliment, Eleanor understood, was not directed toward the quality of her attire but toward its modesty, toward the fact that she did not presume to eclipse the dowager through ostentatious display. The evening proceeded with that peculiar combination of genuine aesthetic engagement and calculated social maneuvering that characterizes aristocratic cultural events. Eleanor found herself introduced to individuals of various rank, a countess whose eyes assessed her with the precision of a jeweler appraising a stone of uncertain value, a gentleman whose conversation moved from paintings to estate management with the easy fluency of someone accustomed to finding significance in both, an elderly widow whose questions about Eleanor's family origins were framed as polite curiosity but functioned as interrogation. It was at the conclusion of this final interview that Eleanor became aware of a presence that operated at the periphery of her vision with the persistence of discomfort. A man in pale gloves and exquisite dress whose pale eyes followed the movements of Alistair and herself with an intensity that suggested calculation rather than mere social interest. "That," said a voice at her elbow, "is Mr. Silas Crowhurst, the Duke's cousin and legal adviser. He is also, though few would state it so directly, a man of considerable ambition and limited ethical restraint." Eleanor turned to find a woman of perhaps 30 years, dressed in slate blue silk, regarding Crowhurst with an expression of barely concealed disdain. "I am Mrs. Eleanor Weatherby," the woman continued. "I believe you lodge with my cousin, Mrs. Weatherby. She has informed me of certain arrangements. I thought it prudent to warn you that Crowhurst is not a man who accepts alterations to his anticipated inheritance with equanimity." "Thank you, Mrs. Weatherby," Eleanor said carefully. "I confess I am uncertain what alterations you reference. The alteration of believing the Duke unmarried, thus dependent upon himself for decision-making, into believing him committed to a woman. Whether that woman is real or performative matters less to Crowhurst than it does to the inheritance itself. A married duke is a duke with different priorities. A married duke is less likely to be manipulated by solicitors who have constructed entire narratives around his solitude." Before Eleanor could formulate a response, Alistair appeared at her side with the perfect timing of a man accustomed to reading the small dramas that unfold in public spaces. "Eleanor," he said to Mrs. Weatherby, You have been inflicting your political observations upon my companion. I have warned you repeatedly that your tendency toward directness is unsuitable for drawing-room discourse. I have merely been providing Miss Fairbourne with information that might prove useful," Mrs. Weatherby replied, with a smile that suggested no apology whatsoever. "Information, I might add, that you appear reluctant to offer yourself. Because some intelligence is more potent when discovered gradually," Alistair said. To Eleanor, he extended his hand. "Come." The Rembrandt has been repositioned to the main wall. It requires fresh viewing. As they moved through the gallery, Eleanor became aware that she was navigating not one story but several simultaneously, the genuine story of two people confined by circumstance into a false proximity, the story that society perceived, in which attraction and compatibility were being gradually revealed, the story that Crowhurst was constructing, in which this apparent commitment was a tool to be exploited, and the story inscribed in the marriage register, the crossed-out truth that both she and Alistair carried in their consciousness with the weight of contradiction. Before the Rembrandt, Alistair spoke quietly. Eleanor was correct, though her manner was deplorable. Crowhurst will move against us, using whatever leverage the appearance of our attachment provides. My mother anticipated this. She has not told you because she believes information constrains freedom, but Crowhurst has already begun to suggest that our commitment is not genuine, that it is merely a performance to circumvent his perfectly reasonable concerns for the estate's stability. Will he succeed? Eleanor asked. Only if he can produce evidence that our attachment is false. Otherwise, society will demand that we fulfill what appearance has suggested. And what does society demand precisely, Your Grace? He looked at her fully then, and his expression contained something that resembled not tenderness, but something approaching it, an acknowledgement of the sacrifice she had made, and the possibility that such sacrifice might be transformed into something that resembled, if not reality, then at least a form of truth that could sustain them both. That we announce an engagement, Eleanor, that we set a date for a wedding that will be performed not as theatre, but as an actual marriage. The Ashford ball occurred on Saturday evening, in the great ballroom of Ashford House, where crystal chandeliers rendered the assembled company in light that was simultaneously flattering and unforgiving. The orchestra played from a dais of polished wood, and the floor had been waxed to a finish so perfect that it reflected both the dancers and the ceiling in equal measure. Eleanor stood at the threshold in a dress of palest blue silk, a colour chosen, as instructed by the dowager, to suggest neither the boldness of the unmarried nor the established dignity of the married, but something between, a woman of defined but not yet finalized status. Her hair had been arranged by the dowager's own lady's maid, with a precision that suggested not merely grooming, but rather a form of preparation, as if she were being ceremonially transformed from companion into something approaching nobility. Alistair stood beside her, immaculate in black evening dress, his expression the practiced neutrality of a man who has spent years controlling the visibility of his own emotions. Yet when his eyes met hers, there was in them a question, or perhaps a request, that she see beyond the performance to the man who had begun to recognize in her not merely a solution to his political difficulties, but a presence that had altered the texture of his solitude. "The first dance," the dowager said, appearing at their side with an abruptness that suggested she had been observing them from another angle, "will be the waltz. You will dance it together, which will be remarked upon. Then the supper, then a second dance, the cotillion, which will provide opportunity for society to discuss what they have observed." The orchestra began to play, a waltz rendered in that particular key that suggests romance without demanding it. Alistair extended his hand and Eleanor took it, feeling the steadiness of his palm against her gloved fingers. They moved into the pattern of the dance, and suddenly they were enclosed within the circle of turning couples, visible and yet also somehow isolated within the shared rhythm of music and movement. For the first time, she felt the full articulation of his body, the line of his spine, the precision of his steps, the way he moved with her as though they had rehearsed this particular pattern 1,000 times. "Do you know what will be said tomorrow?" he asked, his voice low beneath the music. "That the Duke dances with his chosen one, as though she has been chosen not by circumstance but by the heart's own necessity. That he touches her with the reverence of a man who has discovered something valuable. Is that what they will say, Your Grace?" "No," he replied. "They will say that I have finally taken a wife and that she is modest, well-behaved and suitable. They will be pleased that the matter is settled. My cousin Crowhurst will calculate whether this changes his position." The ton will begin to consider where your family's connections lie and whether your dowry is as modest as your bearing suggests. And what will you say, Alistair? The waltz turned them, and for a moment they were near the window, where the London night pressed against the glass like a dark thing seeking entrance. His eyes found hers in the reflection of the mirror, and in that doubled image, she saw something shift in his expression, the moment when performance and reality became indistinguishable. "I shall say nothing," he replied, "and in that silence, I shall allow society to write its own story. If the world believes us genuine, then the protection of that belief becomes a shield for you. And if I find myself beginning to believe it as well, if I find that the woman I was commanded to accept at my mother's direction has become someone whose genuine presence I have come to value, then perhaps the fiction will transform itself into something approaching the truth," the waltz concluded. Alistair released her hand, yet for a moment too long the echo of contact remained. They withdrew from the floor, and the ton's eyes tracked their movement with the concentration of a unified witness, observing the resolution of a promise. At supper, seated beside Alistair, Eleanor felt the full weight of society's attention crystallized into visible reality. Every glance, every whispered remark, every carefully calculated distance maintained by those who wished to express disapproval was absorbed and transmitted through the ballroom like a current of invisible electricity. And then, as the second course was being served, a voice emerged from the general murmur, a voice belonging to Mr. Crowhurst, who had positioned himself at a nearby table with the deliberate placement of a man ensuring that his words would carry precisely as far as he intended. "Of course," Crowhurst was saying to a gentleman of his acquaintance, "the Duke's sudden attachment is remarkable in its fortuitous timing. One might almost believe it had been engineered to address certain legal complications currently emerging regarding the estate." Eleanor felt Alistair's hand, which had been holding his wine-glass with studied indifference, lower slowly to the table. His jaw, visible from her angle, had tightened into a line of controlled fury. "Cousin," Alistair said, his voice cutting through the murmur of the dining room with the precision of a blade, "I have overlooked your insinuations regarding my motives with the charity that one extends to a relation of limited perception. However, I find that my tolerance for your implications regarding my personal attachments has reached its terminus." He set down his glass with deliberate care. "Miss Fairbourne has honoured me with her presence and her companionship. I intend that she shall do so for the remainder of her days as my wife. Should you wish to contest this arrangement, I suggest you address your concerns through proper legal channels rather than through the social mechanism of whispered doubt." The ballroom had gone very quiet. All motion seemed to have ceased, the orchestral music continuing as if nothing had shifted, yet everything having shifted nonetheless. Eleanor felt, in that silence, the moment of transformation. The crossed-out entry in the marriage register suddenly possessed a new weight, a new meaning. What had begun as fiction had, through the simple mechanism of public declaration, acquired the possibility of becoming something approaching reality. Crowhurst, his pale face flushed, made a gesture of dismissal and rose from his seat. Several gentlemen near him appeared suddenly engaged in the study of their wine-glasses, unwilling to endorse his position through public support. Alistair turned to Eleanor, and in his eyes she perceived not merely duty or necessity, but something that had begun to resemble, with each passing moment of performance, an emotion that might have been genuine choice. "Shall we dance the cotillion?" he asked, extending his hand, "and let society believe what it will." The morning following the ball arrived with the peculiar quality of revelation. The sun crossed London in patterns of golden shadow, and Eleanor found herself, for the first time in her residence at Mrs. Weatherby's modest house in Belgrave Square, the subject of calls. Flowers arrived by the hour. Roses, lilies, hothouse orchids rendered in colours that nature had not intended. Calling cards accumulated upon the mantelpiece with the weight of sudden importance. The ton, it appeared, had decided to accept her. Yet beneath this reversal of circumstance, Eleanor carried a new anxiety, one more subtle and more dangerous than the fear of social exposure. For in the moment when Alistair had declared his intention that she should become his wife for the remainder of her days, the boundary between performance and reality had begun to dissolve in ways she was not certain either of them had anticipated. It was Alistair himself who appeared at her door at 4 o'clock, requesting a private audience. Mrs. Weatherby, with the delicacy of a woman who understood the implications of such visits, withdrew to her second-best drawing-room, leaving them alone in the larger parlour where spring light fell through windows that faced the square. I have done something without your consent, Alistair said without preamble or the usual courtesies. I ask your forgiveness, though I confess I am not certain forgiveness is what I deserve. Eleanor rose from her seat, feeling the small throb of apprehension that had become familiar to her in recent days. What have you done, Your Grace? I have spoken to my solicitor. I have instructed him to prepare documentation that will, upon the conclusion of the agreed 8 weeks, allow you the choice of whether to proceed with the marriage as a permanent arrangement or to withdraw with a settlement of such generosity that you need never depend upon employment again. I have ensured that you shall have, in legal terms, complete autonomy regarding our future. He moved to the window, positioning himself with his back to her, that gesture which she had come to recognize as indicating the depth of his emotional engagement. I have also, he continued, written to my cousin Crowhurst, informing him that should he attempt to use the marriage register as evidence of deception, I shall expose his own manipulations regarding estate funds to the attention of His Majesty's authorities. He will, in essence, be rendered silent by the threat of his own exposure. You have removed my constraint, Eleanor said slowly, understanding the magnitude of what he had done. You have transformed the arrangement from coercion into choice. I have attempted to do so, Alistair replied, and when he turned to face her, his expression contained a vulnerability she had not previously witnessed. Yet I confess, I am uncertain whether I have acted out of genuine regard for your autonomy or out of a more selfish motive. I have become, Eleanor, a man who wishes very much to believe that your presence in my life is chosen rather than commanded. And I have used the only power available to me, legal and financial authority, to create the conditions under which that belief might be sustained. Eleanor moved toward him, and in doing so, she crossed a threshold she had not consciously acknowledged until that moment. She stood close enough that she might have touched him, yet she maintained the distance that propriety demanded, even in private. You have given me an impossible gift, she said. For now I must question whether any choice I make is genuinely mine, or merely a response to the gratitude I feel for your gesture. Then we are equally trapped, Alistair replied. I cannot know whether my growing attachment to you is genuine response to your particular self, or merely the natural human tendency to transform what begins as duty into something resembling affection. And you cannot know whether your own regard is authentic or a form of Stockholm's emotional consequence, the development of feeling for one's captor out of sheer proximity and dependence. He extended his hand, and this time Eleanor took it without hesitation. His palm was warm against hers, his fingers steadier than she would have expected of a man whose voice had just contained such doubt. There is, however, he said, one method by which we might approach clarity. I propose that we extend the performance beyond the agreed 8 weeks, that we allow society to believe in our engagement, and allow ourselves the time and privacy to determine whether what has begun as fiction might, through the mechanism of genuine living, become something approaching truth. If after 3 months of actual engagement, rather than the theatrical variety, you wish to withdraw, I shall honor that choice with all the generosity the law permits. And if I do not wish to withdraw, then we shall proceed to marriage, and we shall do so as 2 people who have earned the right to claim that choice was involved, however circuitously it was acquired. Eleanor felt something settle in her chest, not certainty, but rather a form of acceptance. The machinery of society and circumstance had brought them to this moment, but within that machinery, something that might have been genuine connection had begun to take root. I accept your proposal, she said, though I confess I am frightened of what 8 weeks might reveal. As am I, Alistair replied, yet I find that fear in this instance seems preferable to the certainty of remaining as we were, you invisible, me armored. Should we not at least attempt to discover what lies beyond both conditions? The announcement of the formal engagement took place at a dinner hosted by the Dowager Duchess, an event of considerable social magnitude. The dining room of Ashford House was transformed into a space of austere elegance, with candles rendering the assembled company in light that suggested benediction rather than mere illumination. 30 guests of significant rank were present, and the Dowager, in a dress of deep mourning silk accented with diamonds, presided over the proceedings with the authority of a woman who had spent 6 decades perfecting the mechanism of aristocratic command. I am pleased, the Dowager announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the room with the precision of a woman accustomed to being heard, to inform you of the betrothal of my son, the Duke of Ashford, to Miss Eleanor Fairborn. The wedding will take place at St. James in 8 weeks' time. allowing for the proper preparation of announcements and arrangements. I am confident that the ton will approve of my son's choice. The phrase, "I am confident that the ton will approve," contained, for those skilled in reading the dowager's particular rhetoric, a statement that approval was not optional, but rather mandatory. To suggest otherwise would be to contradict the judgment of one of the season's most formidable matriarchs. Eleanor, seated beside Alistair, felt the weight of every eye in the room focus upon her with the concentration of a burning glass. She had worn a dress of ivory silk, a colour chosen deliberately by the dowager to suggest neither the boldness of a girl nor the desperation of an older woman, but rather the composed elegance of someone entering marriage from a position of quiet strength. Her hands, resting upon the damask tablecloth, remained absolutely still, though beneath the table her fingernails pressed small crescents into her palms. The dinner proceeded through multiple courses, each more elaborate than the last, and through it all Eleanor was required to sustain conversation with gentlemen of consequence, respond to the covert assessments of their wives, and maintain the appearance of a woman who had moved through the world with confidence rather than fear. Yet it was Alistair who, at intervals throughout the evening, would place his hand upon her arm or lower his voice to address a remark specifically to her that suggested, to the assembled company, a man engaged not merely in the performance of attachment, but in something approaching genuine partnership. It was after the ladies had withdrawn to the drawing room, that particular torture of Victorian entertainment, in which women were separated from men precisely when conversation might have become substantive, that the true test emerged. The dowager drew Eleanor aside into a smaller room, designated for those of elevated status, away from the other ladies. "You have performed adequately," the dowager said, settling into a chair of considerable height and authority. "Better than adequately, perhaps. My son does not look as though he is being led to sacrifice. That is no small matter. I am honoured by your approval, Your Grace," Eleanor replied carefully. "My approval is not the matter under consideration," the dowager said. "Rather, I wish to address something that has come to my attention through the mechanism of household intelligence. You and my son have been conducting private correspondence, letters to be precise, delivered through channels that suggest intent to conceal their existence from my view." Eleanor's throat had become very dry. The letters in question, 3 of them, each composed with deliberate care, had been exchanges regarding their genuine hopes and fears, written after Alistair had made his gesture of legal autonomy and before the engagement announcement. They had been, in essence, the first true communication between them that carried no element of performance or social necessity. "Yes, Your Grace," Eleanor said, deciding that honesty was more sustainable than deception. "We have written to one another. The correspondence has been private, as befits communication between two people, attempting to understand whether what began as duty might become something more genuine." The dowager regarded her with an expression that might have been surprise, or might have been something approaching approval. "I have read the letters," she said without preamble. "The housekeeper, who is loyal to my interests, delivered them to my hands. I read them not out of invasion of privacy, though I acknowledge that is what occurred, but out of necessity. I required that I understand whether my son has been compromised into a situation that will produce only misery." She rose, moving to the window where the London night pressed against the glass. "What I discovered, however, was not misery, but rather the beginning of something that might, with considerable time and mutual effort, approximate genuine affection. My son writes of you with the attention to particularity that he has never extended to another woman. He notes that you smooth the edge of your reticule when anxious, that you listen rather than merely hear, that you have begun to speak your honest thoughts where previously you were silent. These are not observations a man makes regarding a woman he has been coerced into accepting. Your Grace, I do not know how to respond to this revelation." "You need not respond," the dowager said. "I am merely informing you that I have violated your privacy, and that I have done so with full knowledge of the violation. I am also informing you that I regret nothing, because the violation has produced clarity regarding my son's capacity for genuine choice, even when constrained by circumstance. You may go now, the other ladies are waiting, and it would be remarked if you remained absent much longer." 3 weeks into the formal engagement, Eleanor found herself navigating a social landscape that had been fundamentally transformed by the shift from invisible companion to future duchess. She was invited to luncheons and morning visits, consulted regarding household arrangements at Ashford House, and observed with an intensity that suggested that Tunn was engaged in the collective project of reassessing her from scratch. It was during one such visit, a gathering of ladies ostensibly for the purpose of viewing new furnishings for the Ashford townhouse, that the first genuine threat to their arrangement presented itself in a form that neither Alistair nor Eleanor had anticipated. Lady Pemberton, a woman of considerable age and even more considerable knowledge of aristocratic genealogy, set down her teacup with deliberate care. "My dear Miss Fairbourne," she said, and the sweetness of her tone suggested something considerably less benign, "I have been endeavoring to locate your family among the established peerage and gentry records. It is a hobby of mine, you understand, genealogy, and I have become quite proficient at tracing lineages. Yet I find myself remarkably unable to locate any Fairbournes of significant standing. Might you illuminate my confusion?" The drawing-room, which had been animated by polite conversation moments before, had become very quiet. Eleanor felt the collective attention of 12 women focus upon her with the intensity of a unified examination. She set down her own teacup, the motion steadier than her internal composure, and met Lady Pemberton's gaze directly. "My family, Lady Pemberton, are from Hampshire. My father was a man of education, and some means, though not of title. My mother was the daughter of a clergyman. I was educated as befits a woman of respectable birth but limited wealth. I have made my way through employment because such was my circumstance." "Employment!" Lady Pemberton's exclamation contained the quality of theatrical shock, though her expression suggested calculation rather than genuine surprise. "The Duke's bride is a woman of trade." "The Duke's bride," Eleanor said, her voice pitched to carry to every woman in the room, "is a woman who has conducted herself with propriety and discretion throughout her life. Whether that life has included the necessity of employment is a matter between myself and those who have employed me. I confess I fail to perceive how honest labor, engaged in by necessity rather than vice, renders one unsuitable for marriage." "Yet surely," Lady Pemberton continued, warming to her theme, "the Duke was unaware of these particulars. Surely his proposal was made in ignorance of your origins." It was at this moment that the door to the drawing-room opened, and Alistair entered with an abruptness that suggested he had been informed of the conversation's direction and had judged intervention necessary. His expression was calm, yet his eyes contained a fire that Eleanor had not previously witnessed. "On the contrary," he said, addressing the room rather than Lady Pemberton specifically, "I am entirely aware of Miss Fairbourne's origins and her history of respectable employment. I am also aware that such origins and such employment render her considerably more estimable in my judgment than many women of ancient lineage but questionable virtue. My betrothed has sustained herself through honest industry. That is not a shame to be concealed, but rather a virtue to be acknowledged." He moved to Eleanor's side and extended his hand. She took it, and in that gesture an entire narrative was communicated to the assembled company, that the Duke of Ashford was not merely accepting a woman of modest origins, but was rather actively choosing her, aware of every particular of her circumstance. "I believe," Alistair continued, "that my mother intended the morning to conclude with the viewing of the formal wedding announcements. Shall we proceed to the drawing-room where they have been displayed? I am certain that the assembled company will wish to admire the typography, which is, I am told, quite exceptional." The transition was executed with such perfect ease that those assembled had no choice but to follow. Lady Pemberton, her conversational attack blunted by Alistair's intervention, was forced to rise and proceed with the others. Yet Eleanor, as she moved beside him, felt the tremor of gratitude that accompanied recognition of his choice, not merely to defend her, but to do so in a manner that elevated the truth of her circumstances into something approaching nobility. Later, when they had contrived to find themselves alone in the library, a space where their privacy might be rationalized through the presence of household business requiring consultation, Alistair took her hands in his. "I have discovered," he said, "that I am no longer capable of bearing the pretense that our engagement is anything other than entirely genuine. I know that we were brought together by circumstance and necessity. I know that the arrangement began as coercion. Yet I find that I have developed a regard for you that has transcended entirely the mechanisms of its origin. I am asking you, Eleanor, to confirm that you feel something approaching what I feel, or to tell me that I have constructed an illusion and must dismantle it before greater harm occurs." Eleanor looked at his face, the composed features now revealing the vulnerability that lay beneath, the eyes that sought in hers confirmation of something he had come to need. "I feel," she said slowly, "that I have been transformed by your regard in ways I did not anticipate. I feel that the woman who entered this arrangement as a companion performing a role has become someone different, someone who desires your presence not from gratitude or necessity, but from genuine choice. I cannot claim that I love you, Alistair, for I am not yet certain what that word means in application to myself, but I can claim that I have begun to hope that what we have discovered together might be transformed into something that resembles love. He drew her close, not with passion, but with the tenderness of recognition. And in that moment, the crossed-out entry in the marriage register seemed to possess the possibility of erasure and rewriting with ink that would not require the line of negation. The week preceding the wedding arrived with the peculiar quality of suspended time. London seemed to hold its breath, and within that held breath, Eleanor found herself caught between the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. The dressmakers had completed their work, a gown of silk and Brussels lace that rendered her, when she viewed herself in the mirror, almost unrecognizable. Yet beneath the transformation of garment and arrangement, she remained fundamentally herself, a woman who had learned to navigate the world through observation and restraint, who had discovered in Alistair not merely safety, but genuine partnership. It was on the morning of the day before the wedding that the crisis emerged, the sort of crisis that threatens to unravel every carefully constructed arrangement through the simple mechanism of revealed truth. Mr. Silas Crowhurst appeared at Ashford House with a solicitor in tow, both men bearing expressions of grave legality. They were admitted to Alistair's private study, and it was from that room that Alistair emerged, his composure intact but his eyes containing a fury that was barely contained. He sent for Eleanor immediately, and she found him standing before the window of the dowager's sitting room, his jaw set with the rigidity of a man absorbing difficult information. "Crowhurst has attempted," Alistair said without preamble, "to invalidate the marriage through claim that the entry in the register, my mother's crossed-out notation of your name, constitutes fraudulent intention. He argues that the very act of crossing out the entry proves that the original inscription was never genuine, and therefore that any marriage contracted on the basis of that entry would be void ab initio. Can he succeed?" Eleanor's voice was remarkably steady, though her hand had found its way to the inside of her wrist. "In legal terms, no. My solicitor assures me that his claim is without merit. However, in social terms, the exposure of the arrangement, the revelation that your name was originally inscribed only to be struck through, will accomplish what legal action cannot. It will destroy your reputation entirely." He moved toward her, and the proximity contained desperation. "I have concluded," he said, "that there remains only one resolution. We must marry tomorrow as planned, and then immediately upon our return from the wedding breakfast, we shall go to the register and inscribe your name anew, not crossed out, but permanent. We shall do so publicly with witnesses, and we shall create an entirely new entry that acknowledges the crossed-out line, but supersedes it with the reality of our marriage." "You would rewrite the record?" Eleanor asked. "I would rewrite it," Alistair replied, "because I have come to understand that records are merely human inscriptions. They record what we choose to acknowledge, but they need not permanently capture what we have chosen to deny or to correct. You arrived in that register as a temporary necessity. I am proposing that you remain in it as a permanent choice." The wedding day arrived with the clarity of decision made, St. Ian. James Church, small enough to be intimate yet grand enough to convey significance, was decorated with flowers that suggested not the exuberance of spring, but rather the controlled elegance of aristocratic taste. The pews held perhaps 100 guests, the essential members of society, whose presence would confirm the legitimacy of the union. Eleanor stood at the threshold of the church in her gown of silk and lace, her hands holding a bouquet of lilies, rendered in palest cream. Behind her, Mrs. Weatherby adjusted the veil with the tenderness of a woman performing a ritual of passage. Before her, the aisle stretched toward Alistair, who stood at the altar in black mourning coat, his expression focused upon her with an intensity that suggested the weight of everything they had endured to arrive at this moment. When she moved forward, the assembled company rose. The orchestral arrangement began, not a triumphant processional, but rather something more complex, a melody that seemed to contain both sorrow and joy in equal measure, as if acknowledging that all transformations carry within them the loss of what was, even as they create what will be. Alistair extended his hand as she reached the altar. His palm was warm and steady, and when their fingers intertwined, It was with the certainty of two people who had progressed beyond the boundaries of performance into something that might reasonably be called genuine commitment. The vicar, an elderly man of considerable dignity, conducted the ceremony with the solemnity that befits the joining of a duke to a woman who had arrived at that position through the unconventional path of necessity transformed into choice. When the moment came for Alistair to speak his vows, his voice carried through the church with complete clarity. "I, Alistair Hartwell, Duke of Ashford, take thee, Eleanor Fairborn, to be my wife. I do so with full knowledge of who you are, not merely the woman society perceives, but the woman I have come to know through genuine proximity and honest communication. I take you as my wife with gratitude for your courage, with respect for your virtue, and with the hope that what began as necessity might flourish, in time, into something approaching the form of love that poets celebrate." When Eleanor spoke her vows, her voice was quieter but no less resolute. "I, Eleanor Fairborn, take thee, Alistair Hartwell, Duke of Ashford, to be my husband. I do so with gratitude for the autonomy you have granted me, with admiration for the man who has chosen to see me as I am, rather than as society has rendered me, and with the genuine hope that our future will be constructed not from duty, but from the authentic regard we have discovered for one another." The ring that was placed upon her finger was simple platinum, without excessive ornamentation, a choice Alistair had made deliberately to suggest not the weight of obligation, but the simplicity of truth. When they emerged from the church as man and wife, the London afternoon was rendered in light that seemed almost ceremonial in its clarity. The assembled guests offered their congratulations, and the Tun's machinery of observation and approval operated at full capacity, recording every detail for the drawing-room discussions that would occupy the afternoon teas of Mayfair for weeks to come. Yet neither Alistair nor Eleanor lingered for extended conversation. They departed in the carriage that had been prepared for them, and instead of proceeding to the wedding breakfast at Ashford House, they directed the coachman to the library where the marriage register resided. The library of Ashford House was rendered in afternoon light, golden, measured, and absolute. The marriage register rested upon its mahogany lectern, as it had for 164 years, containing within its pages the accumulated inscriptions of generations of dukes and their duchesses. Yet the final page, where Eleanor's name had been inscribed and then crossed through with the line of negation, held within it now only memory of that strange liminal state. Alistair stood beside the lectern, his coat still bearing the formality of the morning's ceremony. In his hand he held a pen, not the administrative instrument his mother had used to record necessity, but rather a finer implement, one that suggested intention rather than mere procedure. Eleanor stood beside him, still wearing the wedding dress, the veil now pushed back to reveal her face in its entirety. "I have decided," Alistair said, his voice steady and purposeful, "that the crossed-through entry must remain. It is a record of how we arrived at this moment, and to erase it would be to erase the truth of our journey. However, I have also decided that we shall inscribe a new entry, not in the space that was left blank, but rather in the margin beside the crossed-through line. A new inscription that acknowledges what was and what has become." He dipped the pen in fresh ink, the same deep black that had inscribed her name in the first instance, and with careful precision wrote in the margin, "Eleanor Hartwell, Duchess of Ashford, inscribed anew upon this day, 15th of May, in the year of our Lord 1851, not as necessity or coercion, but as the deliberate and freely chosen commitment of a man who has learned that the deepest form of honor lies not in the performance of duty, but in the recognition of genuine worth." The crossed-through entry records how she arrived. This inscription records that she has chosen to remain, witnessed by myself and by the hand that writes these words in full acknowledgement of the journey that has brought us to this point. He stepped back, and Eleanor moved forward. She took the pen from his hand, and beneath his inscription, she added her own words in a hand that was trembling slightly, yet resolute. "I, Eleanor Hartwell, Duchess of Ashford, do affirm that what was inscribed as temporary has become, through the grace of genuine regard and the courage of two people learning to see one another beyond the constraints of circumstance, something approaching permanent. I accept this inscription not with gratitude born of necessity, but with the joy of a woman who has discovered that she was not merely chosen, but was chosen for reasons that matter, for who she is, not for what she could provide. May those who read these words understand that dignity does not emerge from the station we are born to, but from the choices we make and the people we choose to stand beside. When she set down the pen, both inscriptions were visible, the crossed-through entry, the new inscription, and her own affirmation. The register, which had recorded only the permanent and the legitimate, now held within its pages the honest recording of how permanence and legitimacy had been earned through the mechanism of genuine choice, hard-won and authentic. The Dowager Duchess, who had been admitted to the library for this final ceremony, approached the register with the deliberation of a woman acknowledging both her role in their union and her recognition that what she had manipulated had transformed into something beyond her control and her design. "It is," she said, her voice steady and measured, "a remarkable record. My son has taken a woman who arrived through coercion and has elevated her through the mechanism of genuine regard. You have both accomplished what I could not accomplish alone. You have transformed necessity into choice, and in doing so, you have created something that might serve as a model for how society itself might be transformed if it had the courage to see beyond the scaffolding of tradition and propriety." She placed her hand upon the register, her aged fingers trembling slightly. "I am proud," she said, and the words emerged with the weight of confession, "of my son's capacity to love. I am equally proud of your capacity to accept that love without bitterness, regarding how it arrived. You have both taught me that honor is not maintained through control, but through the granting of autonomy and the trust that authentic choice, once offered, will be reciprocated with genuine commitment." As the sun moved through the sky and the afternoon light shifted from gold to amber to the deep bronze of approaching evening, Eleanor and Alistair remained in the library, standing before the register that now contained the record of their journey, the initial crossing out, the desperate notation, and finally the new inscription that transformed what had been written in negation into something affirming the possibility of transformation. The marriage register of the House of Ashford would, in future generations, tell not merely of lineage and duty, but of the remarkable instance when a woman who had arrived as nothing became, through the honest regard of a man who was willing to see her, everything. When social necessity became genuine partnership. When what was crossed out was rewritten not with erasure, but with the addition of new pages that acknowledged both the darkness and the light that had brought them to their union. That evening, as servants moved through the house preparing for the wedding breakfast that would be conducted on the following day, Eleanor stood upon the balcony of what was now her room, the Duchess's chambers in Ashford House, rendered in furniture of considerable age and comfort. Alistair joined her there, and they stood together in silence as London's lights began to illuminate the darkness, each light representing a story, a life, a series of choices made and consequences endured. "Do you regret," Alistair asked quietly, "the manner in which we arrived at this moment?" Eleanor considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She thought of the crossed-out entry, of the coercion that had brought her into his world, of the fear and uncertainty that had characterized the first weeks of their arrangement. "I regret," she said slowly, "that circumstances required such extraordinary means to accomplish what might have occurred through simpler, more direct mechanisms. Yet I do not regret the journey itself, for in being forced to perform a role I discovered something genuine. In being commanded to be near you, I discovered that proximity itself could become a form of intimacy. And in what began as your obligation toward me becoming choice, for both of us, I have discovered that authenticity is not diminished by having arrived through unconventional means, but is rather deepened by the recognition that we chose, freely and deliberately, to remain once the initial compulsion had been removed." Alistair took her hand, and in that gesture they stood together as the darkness of London surrounded them, and the lights of the city continued their patient illumination of the night. The marriage register lay below them, its pages recording not merely duty fulfilled, but the remarkable transformation of two people who had learned that the deepest commitments are those we choose, not those we are compelled to accept. In the peculiar alchemy of Victorian society, where duty and desire were often rendered inseparable, there emerges from this narrative a profound truth about the nature of authentic commitment. Eleanor Fairborn arrived at the threshold of the Duke's world through coercion, through the inexorable machinery of social necessity. She was chosen not for her virtue or her worth, but because circumstance and strategic necessity had positioned her as a solution to a problem of inheritance and reputation. Yet what transformed her journey from tragedy into something approaching redemption was the moment when Alistair, the architect of that necessity, chose to grant her autonomy, to render the forced arrangement into something that might become, through genuine proximity and honest communication, an authentic partnership. The moral that emerges from this story is not the simplistic notion that love conquers all, nor that good intentions redeem harmful actions. Rather, it is the more subtle and more powerful recognition that authenticity is not something that exists in some pure realm untouched by circumstance, but rather something that is continually being created through the deliberate choices we make, even when constrained by forces beyond our control. For Eleanor, the transformation occurred not when she escaped the constraint, but when she learned to see within the constraint the possibility of genuine choice. For Alistair, the transformation occurred when he recognized that true honor consists not in the performance of duty, but in the granting of autonomy to another, in the willingness to be vulnerable enough to allow someone to choose to leave while hoping they will choose to remain. And for those who encounter this story, the invitation is to recognize that our lives are constantly being written in registers both visible and invisible, that the inscriptions of others and the circumstances of our birth and station are real, and they matter. Yet beneath those inscriptions and circumstances lies the possibility of rewriting, of adding new pages, of transforming what was crossed out into something that can be affirmed and renewed. The mechanism of that transformation is not magic, but rather the slow, deliberate work of seeing one another truly, of granting autonomy even when it terrifies us, and of choosing again and again to remain beside someone not because we are commanded to, but because we have discovered that authentic choice is far more powerful than any obligation. Dear listeners, if this story has stirred your heart, if the journey of Eleanor and Alistair has reminded you that transformation is always possible, and that the deepest forms of love are those we choose freely, then we humbly ask that you join our growing community of Victorian romance enthusiasts. Please subscribe to our channel, Victorian Romance Audio Stories, to ensure that you never miss a single tale of redemption, duty, and the quiet courage it takes to choose authenticity in a world that constantly demands performance. We would be deeply grateful if you would leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on this story. Did Eleanor's journey resonate with you? What do you believe about the nature of choice and circumstance? Have you experienced moments in your own life where what seemed like obligation transformed into something genuine? Your words help us understand the stories that matter most to you, and they inspire us to continue creating narratives that celebrate the complexity of human connection. And if you have a story you would like us to bring to life through our narration, a tale of Victorian romance, of dignity reclaimed, of authentic choice triumphing over circumstance, please reach out. We are always seeking stories that remind us of the profound power of human connection rendered through the language of another era. Thank you for allowing us to share this journey with you. We thank you from the depths of our hearts, on behalf of the entire team at Victorian Romance Audio Stories, for the time you have devoted to listening to this story. Your presence in our community, your engagement with these narratives, and your willingness to believe in the transformative power of authentic connection is what sustains this channel and motivates us to continue creating content that celebrates love, dignity, and the quiet courage of those who choose to remain beside one another. With profound gratitude and deepest respect, Victorian Romance Audio Stories.